Shezad Dawood's works cross cultures, materials and dimensions. His interest in non-linear narrative and conversing with concepts from various times and places leads him to explore a diversely rich creativity, from tantalizingly undeterminable 3D sculptures to startlingly glowing neon drawings, through performance where fantasy meets history and place, and the revelation of layered narratives, treasured and developed, through playful subversion of paint, stitch and print on antique cloth. We went to Shezad Dawood's studio in London's East End to talk about his work and his exhibition titled Towards the Possible Film at Parasol Unit. In your work, you use all sorts of different materials. There's a lovely text in the catalogue by Oliver Bassiano, and he talks about how he thinks that your work often questions certain bounds hold against chaos, or what happens when art lets chaos through the cracks. And he talks about how your work questions how to navigate the field. I'd like to ask you, how do you find your field?
Well, I'm very interested in ideas of non-linear time, and almost that's a sort of guide to how I navigate different ideas and histories and reference points, and often try to juxtapose what might seem odd, I guess, contrasts or juxtapositions of images and ideas. So very much, you know, a field that's not a field.
Are you talking about bringing together myth and fantasy with narrative and story? Is that the sort of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm very interested in maybe where that line blurs between fact and fiction. So, you know, taking a kind of literal history for a walk into a more speculative terrain.
And how do you begin that process?
Well, often it's very much thinking of a very specific landscape. So his idea of talking about a field is very on the money.
It's quite literal, you mean?
Yes, so often, say, for example, with Towards the Possible Film, it's all shot in Sidi Ifni in southern Morocco near the border with the contested zone of the Western Sahara. And, you know, I'll often start with a very particular terrain or territory, and through a process of researching the particular histories that inform that place, I'll then also bring to bear other ideas and other narratives that at first glance might seem an odd match. But for me, it's those sort of odd juxtapositions that perhaps reveal the cracks or the fissures in, you know, what we take to be the real.
Tell us a bit about the contested zone of the Western Sahara. What took you there?
I first actually was a friend of mine who worked for an NGO, an American NGO, who suggested I visit Sidi Ifni, that it would really appeal. And I first visited Sidi Ifni, I think probably 12, 13 years ago. And you know, all my film projects take an age to kind of configure, but this one, that's probably the longest burn. And you know, I suppose like with many territories I sort of visit, I thought, my God, I'd love to come back and film here one day, and you know, it was one of the lucky occasions where I was able to do so. But you know, the particular history of Sidi Ifni, I mean, Morocco gained independence in 1954, but it wasn't until the late 60s that Sidi Ifni reverted to the Moroccan crown from the Spanish after a series of wars called the Ifni Wars, which were fought between Spain, Morocco and the independent tribes of the Western Sahara. And that's where, a bit further south, you still have a sort of porous border where Morocco claims sovereignty, but the independent tribes obviously still do their own thing. And you know, it's still as sort of one of many unresolved territories at the UN. And I like this idea of the unresolved territory. You know, for me, it's that idea of, you know, lines on a map actually beginning as a sort of as a fiction. You know, it takes place in someone's mind. They apply it cartographically to a piece of paper, and then one assumes it's real. But you know, as we all very much know from the very rocky history of the 20th century, you know, my schoolboy atlas looks like a fictional landscape today.
And you introduced a couple of characters in spacesuits into this landscape. You've suggested entities from other planets in a number of your different works. Can you talk to us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, I'm very interested in ideas of, visitors and this idea of where one draws the line of otherness. I tend to kind of get fairly sort of fatigued by, I guess more traditional readings of otherness as being about, the West versus the rest. But I actually think of otherness as a more universal condition in which, different archetypes move in and out of different cultural contexts. So for me, I suppose what was quite interesting in the new film was to have the aliens actually coming out of the sea rather than out of the sky. So perhaps they don't come from another planet or another world, but actually come from our own, but from the depths. This idea that what is the borders of what we know, and where that could be said to take place. But I was interested in various other things as well. Whether it's sort of paleo-contact theory, the idea that ancient astronauts visited humanity at key moments in our technological development came into play. I was also interested in the commonality of sort of mythic archetypes between North Africa, ancient India, and ancient Mexico, that they all have blue-skinned gods. In fact, there's a very interesting collection of statuary in the British Museum that was collected by a group of 18th century aristocrats who were assembling these objects from what at the time were fairly recent archaeological digs in each of those three territories. And these 18th century aristocrats had a theory that actually, the ancient civilizations of India, Mexico, and North Africa formed a kind of Bermuda Triangle of mythic archetype, that is the fount of human mythic archetype. And, given the fact that you've got sort of Krishna in India, Quetzalcoatl amongst the Aztecs, and Osiris in ancient Egypt, all of whom are depicted with blue skin and all of whom sort of transcend death in one way or another. There's a sort of definite prefiguring of a sort of, of a Christian ontology. And so I was just very interested in how maybe these archetypes could play out if we look at them from beyond our maybe more limited frame of reference. And so all of those factors were sort of, informing how I developed my aliens, as it were.
You talk about being interested in a non-linear time, and in some ways perhaps the materials you use evidence that. The old fabrics that you use and then you subvert in some way. There's kind of echoes of the Gee's Bend quilts in Georgia and Southern America. But can you talk to us about how do you find your fabrics and how do you choose them?
Well, I think to respond even to the idea of, say American quilting, I think quilting the world over is an interesting form of narration. In that pretty much universally, you can see the function of quilting as sort of building up layers that tell a story either in a more literal sense, like certain American quilts, or a lot of the quilts I use are actually old Sami quilts from Sindh in Pakistan, and they're traditionally put together by nomadic artisanal weavers, and so the quilt becomes the continuity of these people's lives rather than any particular structure, or they are the structure, in that since they're nomadic, they'll have temporary huts, and the quilt will be the thing that goes with them.
So it'll be the roof of their hut, or the bedding, or
it'll often be somewhere between the bedding, the kitchen floor. Sometimes they've got wonderful tobacco stains or food stains, and in a way I kind of think of those as almost gestures that kind of prefigure my own gestures that then are overlaid. And I like that idea of a conversation, so whether it's a conversation in terms of the textiles or a conversation in terms of the theories and references in the films, for me it's all one larger conversation.
So do you think you're having a conversation from here to then, or from one culture to another, or both?
I'd hope that it encompasses those things, but I hope it goes one stage further and it's actually, a wider conversation that's talking about structure. I'm very interested in how we actually layer our experience. So for me, the action of quilting, and actually even just the patterns inherent in the act of quilting, build up layers of meaning, narration, not in a strict sense, but in a sense of how the different patterns actually sit in tension with each other, almost like tectonic plates. And I'm very interested in how those accrue meaning, whether consciously or by default, formally, aesthetically, and also in terms of, how perhaps the social sciences might try to read it as a form of narration of culture. But of course, there's something in human action that always resists that. There's something in the gesture that always resists being kind of reified or compartmentalized into an isolated fragment, because it always communicates back to the whole. And that's maybe where I'm interested in looking at how different things, whether it's the juxtaposition of a set of images that I might do in a film, or the juxtaposition of images on existing textile fragments, might start to not only build up a picture of the world, but also subvert that picture to reveal new meanings and new connections. So there's something quite rhizomatic, I'd say, in my approach.
And structure of society, environment and culture. I mean, it seems to be what you're talking about. There are marvellous connections, and there's also playfulness in your work, but particularly in your films, in the performance when you go and meet Ram for a glass of beer in a pub as your blue god that you are. Did you do performance when you were a student? Was that part of your...
Actually, I got into film through performance, which is sort of a little known fact. I was doing performances, particularly my whole PhD was about performance practice and the structure of theatrical convention, in terms of how that could, I suppose, particularly with Brechtian and Beckettian devices in the 20th century that ruptured the idea of entrances, exits, the function of characters, or Pirandello even, how that actually, you weren't so bound to a kind of a literal linear storytelling as you might have been before that. And I was very interested in how one could free that up as a methodology for art practice. So a lot of my early work was performance, and those performances, I guess at an early stage you end up using yourself a lot because you're too shy to ask other people to do very silly things for you. And then those performances sort of grew, and I was inviting other artists, curators, critics and writers to perform as different mythic or historical characters, and putting odd characters in juxtaposition with one another. And I began to there's that whole debate around performance documentation, but I was quite interested in really, rather than being worried about the documentation being somehow phony, I was interested in that phoniness. So I was interested in making films of the performances or recontextualizing them in other media, whether that was even through sculptural detritus or even paintings based upon historicizing a certain performative moment, which in itself was an artifice. And then weirdly, those sort of what started off as elements of props and films started to kind of evolve into making films proper. And probably my film feature from 2008 was the kind of I guess the sort of hinge moment where that sort of crossover from performance to film proper starts to take effect. And I guess I've never looked back since, but I think always in my films I'm very aware of artifice, of certain devices that might be said to relate to kind of theatrical convention of the sort of 50s and 60s. How those can be brought to bear in a filmic or cinematic way, while also actually not ignoring my interest in not just structuralist filmmaking, but other schools of experimental filmmaking from India and elsewhere.
You've had a very busy year, and it's only not even summer yet, really. Can you tell us what are you working on now, or towards now?
Well, it has been a very busy year. I'm looking forward to a summer in the studio before it all gets going again in September, but I'm doing the Taipei Biennale with Nicolas Bourriaud in September. The Parasol show tours to Leeds Art Gallery in October, which, you know, typically of me, I don't like to just repeat. So actually at Leeds it's going to be a slightly different configuration, but also I did my PhD in Leeds, so I'm very familiar with their collection. So Sarah Brown, the curator there, has very generously asked or invited me to also, in the solo exhibition of mine, to curate works from the collection in dialogue with some of my works, to kind of highlight some of that idea of, or that frisson of, you know, cross-generational, pollination. So that should be very exciting. And then I have a big solo show in China in November, so no rest for the wicked. No. But I think talking about them, you know, being these sort of beautiful artisanal things, there's actually elements, as you can see, as you get into the more modern period, where they're using fragments of patterns that come out of the back of factories. And I quite like that moment where it sort of hybridizes a step further. This is an interesting one we're working on. It's something a bit new where, I mean, you were asking about how I go about them, and I've always stitched into them, screen printed and hand painted, but this one we've made quite a deliberate sort of hybrid of 3 textiles, almost creating a sort of an odd flag type design, which is then being sort of painted and screened onto. But it's this idea of the sort of fragments that are, and what you can do with them, that, you know, the potential is a sort of exponential. And often, you know, when we were saying before about them occurring in dialogue with the original makers, you know, a lot of the ideas, or each step that for me becomes a new direction, is usually spurred on by something I've drawn from the original, I guess what one might term the original conversations that might have gone on. So a lot of my stitching into the fabrics has come from observing and gaining a facility of mimicry, from mimicking how the original stitches were performed, how even as they travelled from different locations, the quilts are then added to or repaired, but the repairs are often quite decorative. So actually there's certain textiles, I mean, maybe this one's a good example. I don't know if you can get around to it, but there's both a split in the textile, which is actually a painted split, so it doesn't actually occur, but just to the bottom left of it, there's a repaired detail, which is actually obviously what I've done is almost a sort of signature punctum, but based on, you know, experience and kind of playing on what I found in the textiles myself.
But are you doing the stitching as well as the painting, or is some of the stitching there already?
A lot of the stitching is there, but then, you know, I've almost learned to mimic it so I can intervene back into it. And often with the screen printing versus the painting, often what looks screen printed is hand painted, and what is hand painted is screen printed. And playing with that idea of facility, but also some of it's just very practical because of the absorbency of the textiles. Actually, what screens into it ends up looking hand painted, because it sort of absorbs quite in quite a fragmented way, and often
so it becomes almost automatically pixelated.
Exactly.
In a weird way, but through the fabric.
Exactly,
yeah.
And that's something I'm also very interested in. That sort of how you bring digital, the spectre of the digital into the spectre of the past. This is one we're working on for the solo show in China in November, and I guess we began talking about fields and landscapes, and this one is actually trying to reconstitute the landscape of Avebury, but thinking about this idea of how you could, how it would happen through almost digital or video editing. So different elements of the landscape are reconstituted at different scales and reinserted on top of each other. So you get this idea of layering and almost a digital field that's based on an originary field with a very particular magical connotation. No, that idea of sort of layering to create a sort of push-pull effect or a sort of dynamic or kinetic interplay with the surface is very much key to the work. You know, it doesn't go out of the studio till it has that quality. But you know, how much is one revealing the potential that's already there, or how much is one turning something that's flat into something perspectival? You know, and I quite like that idea that there's always the idea of form in the void. Also with a film, I'll usually have an idea of the musical score before I write a thing.
Oh, will you really?
So the music is really key.
That was one thing I didn't mention at all, I'm sorry. I didn't, yeah. It's important to you. Do you write music? No,
but I'm a huge fan of experimental music, so it's often a real driver for all my films, you know, and often I'll have an idea of who I want to work with and why before the film is even fleshed out. And then sometimes that will even help flesh out the film, but then literally I will have conversations with different writers, anthropologists, and I'll just go and say, I'm thinking of doing this, and blah, 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 and they'll go, oh, have you read this? Or, oh, but that makes this, and did you know about that connection? And so that's what I mean by certain things will be confirmed. Yes. Like certain half-formed ideas will be like, oh, there's more in this. Yes. And then certain things, okay, that was a bit crappy. Okay, let's remove that. And you sort of start to pull the pieces together. No, I don't think, I'm not a big one for sort of doing things in isolation. Right. I love to sort of talk it out and get... Has that always been the case? Always since you were a student at Central St Martin's and... So you worked with people there, you did collaborative work there? I think always. I was always, you know, I remember even at the Royal College when I was supposedly doing photography, I was always getting dirty looks for going across to the fashion department or the product design or, you know, or the graphic design and illustration and just seeing what people were up to. Cross-disciplinary? Well, it's just with all that, you know, all those resources at your fingertips to sort of not use them is sort of somehow shocking. Bonkers, yeah. Yeah, for me that sort of, you know, even say with the paintings, even if I'm speaking to ghosts of artisans past, I don't like to work in isolation. I mean, I've never really seen the attraction of a blank canvas. I don't think there is such a thing. Oh, that's interesting. And, well, no, with you there isn't. You don't go with a blank canvas. You go with something that is already there to have a conversation with it. I mean, that's absolutely lovely, actually, yes. But I think we're always doing that. I think even people starting with blank canvases, it's never blank because, you know, you might have people who try and assert, you know, their ego or their will, you know, over and above their reference points or their experiences or their education. But I think it's a bit of a fallacy. I quite like the reverse of actually inviting all those voices to kind of echo. I like polyphony maybe, rather than the idea of a kind of more, you know, forced... What does that mean? What does polyphony mean? Just a multitude of voices to kind of speak, you know, through your agency. Well, it should be. Yes. You know, if something sings, it's kind of doing something. You know, it's even what you were saying before about it being alive. I think that's so much richer than some sort of illusion of subjectivity. Which might, you know, put me in a bit of a minority, but you know, that's just how I like to roll.